This is the first of 2 videos that will help you understand the parts of a eukaryotic cell, plants, animals, fungi, and protists, and all of the cell parts that help them do what they need to do. First, we have 2 definitions that you need to become comfortable with. First, organelles. Inside your body, you have organs. You have a heart, you have a liver, you have a stomach. Each of those has its own specific function. The heart doesn't do what the liver does doesn't do what the skin does, and so on. Inside of a cell, there are very specific structures that perform one specific function. They are called organelles, and we're going to look at a whole list of different organelles. The name itself literally means little organs, although they're not organs, because organs are made of tissues, which are made of cells. And the other definition is cytoplasm. If you picture a water balloon with a bunch of stuff floating around inside of it and anchored to the inside of the balloon, that's basically a model for a cell. And the water inside that water balloon would be like the cytoplasm. Although cytoplasm is not water, it's much thicker. It has a lot of concentrated solution inside of it, so it's a lot of materials floating in that water. That's why it's called a plasm instead of a liquid. The first cell part that we're going to cover is the cell wall. This is the outermost layer of a cell. Think of it as like a scaffolding around the cell. It has lots of pores and openings to allow things to sort of pass through. It's not preventing things from passing through, but it is giving a lot of strength and protection for cells, keeping them rigid, keeping them firm. Animal cells don't have cell walls. If they did, they'd be very rigid, stiff cells, and they wouldn't be able to move around like they need to do. Plant cells do have cell walls made of cellulose. Bacteria have their own cell walls, although they're not eukaryotes. And fungi have cell walls made of chitin. It's one of the big differences between plants and fungi. So as I said, that's the outermost layer here. If you look at this as a slice of onion skin, you can see the dark cell walls here. They're very thick, and every once in a while you can see a spot like right here where the cell membrane has pulled away from the cell wall a little bit. So everything else, a part of the cell, sits inside of the cell wall, and the cells just stack right up next to one another like bricks in a wall. The cell membrane, as we just mentioned, sits just inside the cell wall, except that some organisms don't have cell walls. So like animals, for instance, would have just a cell membrane surrounding their cell. It sort of gives shape a little bit to a cell, but mostly it controls what goes in and out of the cell. It regulates the movement of materials in and out of cells. There are also carbohydrates anchored to proteins that stick out of the cell membrane that act sort of like little feelers. And when they come in contact with other cells, that helps cells recognize that they've come in contact with another cell, that there is another cell there, and that's how cells communicate, because when that contact is made, a chemical signal is sent into one or both cells, telling it what's going on around it. All cells, no matter what type of cell it is, all cells have cell membranes. All eukaryotic cells have a nucleus. Bacteria do not have a nucleus, but plants, animals, fungi, and protists all do have nuclei. A nucleus is like the control center of the cell. The DNA is stored inside the nucleus. The DNA does not leave the nucleus. And the DNA in the nucleus, remember, makes messenger RNA, and this makes, ribosomal RNA, which will help assemble ribosomes, and so on. All eukaryotics have it, although there are a few, such as red blood cells, which once they're made, they actually lose their nucleus, similar to like a worker bee that becomes a drone that won't actually reproduce. It just kind of lives its life and then dies. That's what the red blood cells do. Here we see human cheek cells as viewed under a light microscope. They're blue, not because they're Smurf cells, but because they have been stained blue. You can see the cell membrane surrounding them. You can see all the folds and irregularities in the cell membrane. Here, this one's folded right in the middle. And then you can see the darker spot in the middle. That is the nucleus. In red blood cells, as we said, red blood cells do not have a nucleus because they've lost it after they've been formed. Some nuclei are irregularly shaped, like some of the structures you see here inside these white blood cells. The onion cells that we looked at before, they have a cell wall with a cell membrane just inside of it, but the nucleus floats around inside the cell itself. Sometimes it's attached to the side of the cell. Here it's stained so that it shows up darker. There are a couple important parts of a nucleus. The nuclear envelope, also called the nuclear membrane, is a membrane surrounding and containing the nucleus. So otherwise the DNA would just float outside the nucleus and dissipate throughout the cell. But this contains everything inside of it, and it's a double membrane, and it has lots of pores all through it, little tiny holes, almost like one of those practice golf balls that has holes all over it, except they're much, much smaller holes, but that lets ribosomes get out after they get made, and it also lets messenger RNA get out after transcription has happened inside the nucleus. Okay, the second part is the nucleolus. Not all nuclei will have a nucleolus visible. Sometimes it is visible. It is a much darker spot on the nucleus. There may be multiple nucleoli. They would be darker condensed DNA, and this is where ribosomes get made and they start to get assembled inside the nucleus. Here's an electron microscope image of a cell. This large dark spot here, this very large spot, that's the nucleus. You can see it has a membrane surrounding it. That's the nuclear envelope. And then here, these darker spots, these would be like a nucleolus. Okay, more condensed sections of chromatin or DNA. The next cell part is a chloroplast. Chloroplasts are essentially only found in plants, although some protists, like algae, do have chloroplasts, but you will not find them in animals, because this is where photosynthesis occurs. Okay, they are oblong, usually round or oval. They are green. That's the biggest clue that you're looking at a chloroplast, because the chloroplast is filled with chlorophyll, which is the pigment that traps sunlight and makes sugar. This is a picture of filamentous algae. If you go to a pond or a stream and you see a bunch of what looks like green hair growing on stones and rocks and logs, it's not hair, it's actually algae, and if you look at it under a microscope, it's big long strands of one cell after another, just linked end to end. And under the microscope you can see these little beads here. These are the chloroplasts. Anything you see that's green inside of a cell, that's going to be chloroplasts. And that's where photosynthesis is occurring. Last thing we're going to cover about cell parts in this section of the video is the vacuoles. There's three different types of vacuoles. The first one is the large central vacuole. And this is something you only find in plants. Plant cells use this for a couple of reasons. One is to store extra water. There's nothing in this vacuole. A vacuole is also called a vesicle usually. It's just a fluid-filled sac. And in this sac it's just storing water. And plants need a lot of water to do photosynthesis, so this is like a storage tank for them. But the other thing that it does is when it fills it up, it pushes out against the walls of the cell wall, and that gives support and rigidity to the plant, allowing them to stand upright. Imagine if you had a box, and it was a cardboard box with nothing in it. You could crush it very easily. It wouldn't hold a lot of weight. But if you filled that box up with a balloon and you blew a balloon up inside of that box, that's basically what a plant cell is like. This is the central vacuole here inside of this plant cell, which you're looking at through an electron microscope. Here's the chloroplasts. You can see those, but when this is full of water, it's just pushing all the contents of the cytoplasm and the nucleus and everything right out against the cell wall, which a balloon blown up inside of a box makes it very hard to crush and gives it a lot of strength. If you don't water a plant, loses a lot of water out of its cells, it starts to wilt. You put more water in, the water's going to fill up the vacuole. It's going to push out against all of the cells, and the plant will perk right back up and stand upright again. In this picture you can also see how thick the cell wall is compared to the other things inside of the cell. This right here and this, probably a vacuole of some sort, maybe an extension of the central vacuole because it folds around, and we're just looking at a slice through the cell. And these are the chloroplasts with all the little folds inside where photosynthesis happens. The second type of vacuole is there's food vacuoles and contractile vacuoles. Both of these are found in protist cells because protists are single-celled living organisms. They're going to be eating things, and so when they eat food, it goes in through their mouth and they trap it in a little food vacuole or vesicle, a little pouch to just store their food. Okay, kind of like your pantry. It's not going to be digesting that food, it's just storing it for later. And the second one is a contractile vacuole. These are specialized structures found in protists that contract to squirt out extra water. Protists live in an environment that's pure fresh water, they're much saltier inside than their surrounding environment, so water's constantly flowing into the protist cells. And if they didn't regulate that, they would just swell up and burst. Here's an example of a protist called a stentor. And here it is kind of swimming around, and here it is anchored to a substrate, and it stretches out. And you can see inside of it here somewhere it would have a vacuole that it's going to just squirt out extra water, because if it didn't, it would just fill up and it would pop. This one is a paramecium, and they have a very special star-shaped contractile vacuole. You can see it right here. So if you watch one of these that's live, you will see this part of the pore just close and then slowly open, and then close and slowly open. And then over here there's one on the back side. These are food vacuoles here. The mouth of the paramecium is right in here, and as food gets trapped, it gets trapped in a vacuole, and then it's stored so that it can then later get digested. So this brings us to the end of part 1 video. We have highlighted 3 of the main things that you would find in plants, and only in plants not found in animals, and that being a cell wall, chloroplasts, and a large central vacuole. The second video will go much more into other cell parts that are found universally among all eukaryotes.